The moment the email hit her inbox, Karoline Leavitt paused. Subject: invitation to appear Jimmy Kimmel Live. There was no exclamation mark, no smiley face, no frills, just a plain calculated invitation. She stared at it for a moment, then smiled, not because it was funny but because she understood exactly what this was, a trap. Kimmel didn't invite guests like her out of curiosity. He invited them to mock them, to frame them, to fuel his nightly punchlines. But Karoline wasn't just any guest, she was 26 sharp as attack, and fresh off a series of high-profile press briefings that had the DC press corps scrambling for damage control. She didn't flinch. She clicked reply: I accept, see you Thursday. That Thursday the green room buzzed with controlled chaos, makeup artists, fluttering stage managers, whispering into headsets, cameras rolling test shots. But Karoline sat still, clad in a striking red suit that almost seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. No notes, no phone, just her ready backstage. Kimmel rehearsed his monologue. She's the youngest White House press secretary in history, which makes her just barely old enough to rent a car if she promises not to drive it into a conspiracy theory. The writers laughed. Kimmel smirked. He thought this was going to be easy. The show opened as usual, light, sarcastic. The crowd warmed up to laugh at all the right places, but the energy shifted when her name was called. And now please welcome White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. She stepped onto the stage, heels clicking, chin up. The applause was polite but cautious. People didn't quite know what to expect. Kimmel leaned forward in his chair. Well, Karoline, welcome. This is either very brave or very foolish. She didn't blink. Then let's find out which. The crowd laughed, but not at her. With her. He raised an eyebrow. That wasn't supposed to happen. Now, I'll be honest, he said, when I heard the White House was sending someone to defend that guy, I assumed they'd send someone a little more seasoned. Karoline tilted her head. Well, they did offer him the job, she said, but he declined. Said you were using all the seasoning. The audience erupted. Kimmel chuckled, but his eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to that. He tried to recover, change direction. But seriously, Karoline, how do you sleep at night defending policies that are, let's say, generously controversial? She didn't look away. With a clear conscience, she replied, and a thick binder of actual facts, unlike some people who rely on cards and applause signs. The audience murmured. Some clapped, some sat silent. Something had shifted. This wasn't going to be the soft-spoken assistant stumbling through answers. This wasn't a viral TikTok intern. This was someone who'd memorized her ammo and sharpened every line. And the real reason she was here hadn't even been said yet. As the conversation moved on, the tension only grew thicker. What no one knew yet was that Karoline had come with one sentence, one line she had saved. One sentence she would drop like a match on gasoline. And when she did, everything would explode. The studio lights beat down hot. An unflinching Karoline sat with her hands folded neatly, every muscle relaxed, every smile intentional. But across from her, Jimmy Kimmel was starting to lean harder into his comfort zone. Sarcasm. Let me guess, he said, shifting in his chair. You're here to tell me the media has it all wrong, that everything we say about Trump is just fake news? Karoline didn't flinch. I'm here to remind people that comedy doesn't work if you're too lazy to research the punchline. The audience gave a startled ooh. Some clapped, others weren't sure if they were supposed to. Jimmy chuckled, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. Well, I do my research, thank you very much. And it tells me that this administration has done more spinning than a Soul Cycle class. Karoline nodded. And your writers have done more spinning than CNN after a border security speech. The crowd laughed again, but this time the momentum wasn't Jimmy's, it was hers. Jimmy tapped his pen against his desk, forcing a smile. Okay, you've clearly come prepared. I had to, she said, evenly. You're used to interviewing celebrities, I'm used to briefing the nation there. It was the mood in the studio shifted again. Kimmel's default playbook, ridicule, dismissal, distraction, wasn't landing the same. The usual smirks from his staff behind the camera had faded into tight, silent expressions. Even the band, which usually played Jimmy off when things got dicey, stayed still. He cleared his throat. Well then, let's talk about something serious, he said. Let's talk about January 6th. A few audience members perked up, eager. The tension in the room rose a few notches. Karoline didn't interrupt. She waited. Jimmy leaned in. You still defend the guy who sent people to the Capitol that day? She met his stare. I defend the right of every American to be treated with the same standard of justice, even when the media decides someone's guilty before the facts come out. Jimmy laughed nervously. This time I think we saw the facts, Karoline. We all watched it live. You watched the footage your producers chose, she said sharply. You didn't watch what was withheld. You didn't see the security footage that contradicted your headline. You didn't see the people who walked in and out peacefully, because that doesn't sell ads. Her voice didn't rise, but her words cut with the precision of a scalpel. Jimmy shifted. His audience didn't know how to respond. The room felt different now, less of a comedy show, more like a courtroom where the judge hadn't arrived yet. Karoline continued. If you're going to ask questions like a prosecutor, Jimmy, at least admit that you're only showing one side of the evidence. She paused, letting that sink in, then added softly, or is that not part of the joke? The silence that followed was deafening for a few seconds. Even the crew held their breath. Jimmy broke it with a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. You know, for someone so young you sure don't laugh a lot. Karoline smiled. I laugh, just not when people use their platform to mislead millions and call it entertainment. And there it was again, that slow creeping shift of power in the room. It was becoming undeniable. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't interviewing her anymore. He was trying to survive her, and still. Karoline hadn't played her ace. That one sentence, the one she knew would flip the table, was still sitting quietly in the back of her mind, waiting for the moment Jimmy gave her the perfect opening. And it was coming faster than he realized. Jimmy Kimmel had been here before. Political guests, heated exchanges, controversial monologues. But this wasn't going the way it usually did. Karoline Leavitt wasn't folding, she wasn't dodging, she was flipping his questions on their head, then handing them back. Sharper than before. He smiled, but it was tighter now, more calculated. All right, he said, tapping his note cards. Let's talk about media bias. That's your favorite phrase, isn't it? Karoline leaned in slightly. Not a favorite, just a reality. The audience laughed nervously again. A few claps, a few raised eyebrows. She was winning people over without theatrics, just precision. Jimmy held up a printout. So you recently said in a press conference that media narratives are the single greatest threat to public trust. That's a bold claim, bolder than, say, election fraud. Karoline didn't miss a beat. They're related. When people see selective stories, edited footage, and headlines that contradict reality, trust breaks down. And when trust breaks down, the system weakens. Whether it's about elections, law enforcement, or even late-night TV. The last words landed with a pointed calm. Jimmy blinked. So are you accusing me of weakening democracy? He asked, half laughing. I'm accusing you, Karoline said smoothly, of doing the same thing you claim to fight, pushing narratives without context, then calling it truth. Another ripple moved through the audience. It wasn't quite applause, but it was something more powerful. Attention focused. Kimmel opened his mouth, closed it. Then he tried again. You know, it's funny, when I talk to my audience about the administration, they don't say, wow, thank goodness for Karoline Leavitt. They say, how can someone that smart defend something that broken? Karoline smiled, not defensive, patient. I get that most people only hear your version, and when the only voice you listen to laughs at someone before they speak, it gets easy to believe the joke is the truth. Boom, another hit. The band shuffled. Jimmy shifted. He tried to pull the tone back. Let's talk about something lighter, shall we? I'm assuming you still think Trump's Twitter account should have stayed up. Of course, she said. You don't protect democracy by silencing half of it, even if he spreads misinformation. Karoline paused, then leaned forward. Then let's apply the standard equally. Should your show be taken off air when you get something wrong? And there it was again, another sharp edge delivered without a raised voice, the kind of response that left no escape. Jimmy stared. I think you just compared my jokes to presidential policy. Karoline nodded. If you're going to influence millions every night, you don't get to hide behind the word joke. Not when you're shaping opinions, not when you're choosing which facts get airtime. The silence that followed was no accident, because in that moment Jimmy realized something. He'd lost control. The laughs weren't automatic anymore. The audience wasn't with him by default, and worst of all, his guest wasn't rattled. Karoline Leavitt was not here to survive Jimmy Kimmel. She was here to outmatch him, and somewhere in the back of her mind that one sentence still waited undelivered. It was sharp, surgical, and when the moment was right she would say it, and nothing on that stage would be the same again. Karoline crossed one leg over the other, calm as ever, while Jimmy sat noticeably tenser now. His questions shorter, pauses longer. He tried humor again, reaching for safe ground. So what you're saying is I should do less comedy and more C-SPAN? She smiled slightly. No, I'm saying comedy works best when it punches up, not when it repeats headlines like a teleprompter. With a laugh track, the audience chuckled, but there was an awkwardness now. Not everyone was sure who they were supposed to side with, and Jimmy felt it. This wasn't like debating a senator or mocking a soundbite. This was live, unscripted, and Karoline was proving she could command a room not by yelling but by making sense. Jimmy turned to the audience. I think we just found out who writes her tweets. Karoline didn't take the bait. No one writes them, she replied. And I don't need a writing team to tell the truth. Jimmy exhaled, half a laugh, half frustration. Truth is subjective, he said quickly. Not when there are receipts, Karoline replied, and suddenly she leaned slightly forward, elbows on her knees, voice quieter. But that's the problem, Jimmy. The truth has become entertainment. Opinions dress up as facts. You laugh off stories that deserve serious attention and mock people who dare to ask different questions. There was no applause, not yet, but the room was listening, really listening. Karoline went on. People used to trust the press, now they trust influencers more than anchors. Do you think that just happened, or do you think it's because people are tired of being told what to think by people who refuse to listen? Jimmy sat back silent. She continued, you don't have to agree with me, but at least let people hear both sides without editing them into punchlines. It was surgical, not angry, not loud, but every word landed. And then something no one expected happened. One person in the audience clapped just Once, then another, and then scattered applause began to grow, not massive but unmistakable. Jimmy tried to cover it with a smile. Okay, someone's campaign staff showed up tonight. Karoline gave a light laugh. But her eyes didn't break. They're just Americans, Jimmy. Not everyone claps because they're told to. That line, that one line, made the air shift again. Jimmy went quiet, not frozen, just off rhythm like a musician missing a beat. He picked up another card, put it back down. Suddenly the notes in front of him felt useless. The jokes weren't hitting, the tempo was gone, and the worst part, he knew it because Karoline had flipped the format. This wasn't late night anymore, this was a showdown, and the crowd wasn't here just to laugh, they were watching something real. Karoline sat back in her chair like a chess player waiting for the next move. She hadn't even said the sentence yet, but Jimmy was already losing the game. Jimmy shuffled the cards in his hand again, more to buy time than anything else. His usual rhythm had collapsed. The crowd wasn't laughing the way they were supposed to. Karoline wasn't playing along, and for the first time in a long time he was the one under pressure. Still, he wasn't about to fold. He took a breath. Time to go big. Let me ask you this, Karoline, he said, voice steadying. Do you actually believe Donald Trump tells the truth? I mean, seriously, after all the tweets, the scandals, the indictments, that's the guy you trust? A soft murmur rolled through the audience. This was it, the question meant to corner her. Karoline didn't blink. I trust evidence, she said. I trust results, and I trust that the American people can make decisions for themselves when they're given all the facts, not just the ones someone decides are acceptable. But come on, Jimmy said, pushing now. You don't think the guy ever lies? Karoline looked him dead in the eye. Every politician spins, but not every late night host pretends he's not doing the same. The audience stirred again. A few people laughed, really laughed, others stayed quiet. Jimmy's smile froze. He hadn't expected that angle. Karoline pressed forward, but slower now, measured, calm. You talk about Trump's tweets, let's talk about something bigger. You've got a platform, millions of people tune and they trust you to tell the truth, or at least to joke about it responsibly. But what happens when the jokes become the truth in their minds? Jimmy shifted in his seat. What are you saying? I'm saying people remember punchlines more than headlines. You know that you bank on it now. The crowd was silent. She wasn't attacking, she was unpacking him, and Jimmy felt it. He looked toward his crew. No cue, no backup, just Karoline, still seated, still calm, still waiting, because this was the moment she'd been building toward. The trap Kimmel thought he'd set was actually hers, and it was time. She slowly leaned forward again, voice low, deliberate. You want to know what's dangerous, Jimmy? It's not that people like me support Trump, it's that people like you pretend to be truth-tellers while hiding behind a laugh track. Every time the facts get uncomfortable. Then she paused just for a second and said it, the sentence, the one that would ricochet through every screen, headline and timeline. By morning you don't do comedy anymore, Jimmy, you do damage control. With a punchline boom, the audience sat still for a beat, processing, and then it came, first one person, then three, then the back row. Applause, real applause, not laughter, not sarcasm, appreciation. Kimmel didn't move. He looked like someone who had just realized he was the one being interviewed. Karoline leaned back. She'd said it, the one sentence that ended the illusion, and there was no coming back from it. Jimmy Kimmel sat back in his chair, staring across at Karoline Leavitt like he'd misread the entire game board. He blinked, nodded faintly, then tried to force a chuckle. Well, you certainly came locked and loaded. Karoline didn't even nod. She simply waited, letting the silence hang, letting him feel it, because for once he had to decide how to fill the awkward space. He tried. All right, he said, voice lighter. Now let's talk about something less heavy. How about the weather? I'm guessing climate change is a hoax too. It was a pivot, a weak one. Karoline gave a polite smile. Climate change is real. What's fake is thinking. Late night jokes will fix it. The audience reacted again, this time with a mix of surprise and reluctant approval. Jimmy grinned, but it looked more like a wheeze. Okay, he said, stretching the word, but you've got to admit it's kind of wild to have a press secretary this intense. Karoline tilted her head. What's wild is needing to be intense, just to be heard over noise. Another pause, another pulse through the room. Jimmy cleared his throat. You always this serious? Karoline smiled. Only when someone pretends the truth is just another sketch. There it was again, not anger, not arrogance, just clarity. Jimmy glanced toward the audience as if searching for validation, but the usual crowd cues weren't there. No automatic chuckles, no confident nods, just eyes watching him and her, especially her, because Karoline wasn't fumbling or ranting, she wasn't combative or flustered, she was winning, and that was the most unexpected thing of all. Jimmy leaned forward again, this time a little more honest. So let's just get to it. You think I'm part of the problem, is that it? Karoline took a breath. I think you used to be funny. I think you used to challenge power, but somewhere along the line you stopped doing comedy and started doing commentary dressed up as entertainment, and you stopped challenging the powerful when the powerful were on your side. That was the moment the air in the studio shifted again, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. A few audience members nodded, a couple clapped again, soft, respectful. Jimmy leaned back slowly. He didn't have a comeback, and that said everything. Karoline didn't push further. She didn't need to. She knew what had just happened. That one sentence, you do damage control, with a punchline, had planted itself in the room like a stone in water, rippling through everyone who heard it, and every word that followed only made those ripples grow. The damage was already done. Jimmy had invited her in expecting a headline. He got a headline all right, just not the one he wanted. The cameras were still rolling, but online the explosion had already started. Clips from the interview were spreading like wildfire, 20-second sound bites each more damning than the last. Karoline's words clipped and captioned, "You don't do comedy anymore, Jimmy, you do damage control." That one line had already been tweeted by at least 6 major accounts before the commercial break, even hit inside the studio. Jimmy forced a smile, the kind of smile people wear when they know the tide is shifting, and there's no use swimming against it. "Well," he said, half laughing, "this has been educational." Karoline gave him a single nod. "Glad I could help." The crowd chuckled softly, but it wasn't laughter at her, it was laughter because of her. She had seized the narrative, and there was no unseizing it. Jimmy tried again. "So final question, what's next for you? Planning a run for office?" Karoline shrugged. "Just telling the truth, wherever that takes me." Another clap, a few more this time. The applause wasn't forced, it was earned, and Jimmy knew it. That's what hurt most. The show ended with the usual credits, the theme song, the applause sign blinking above the stage. But something about it felt off. The rhythm had cracked. Backstage, Karoline shook hands with the staff. Some nodded respectfully. One stage hand leaned in and said quietly, "You were something else." She smiled, said, "Thank you," and walked out, still calm, still composed. Her phone was already buzzing. 300,000 views, 400,000. Asha Shaitan Kimmel meltdown was trending by the time she stepped outside. Back in the dressing room, Jimmy sat alone. The jokes hadn't worked, the smug angle didn't land, and worst of all, he could already see the headlines being written without his input. Karoline Leavitt flips the script on late night television. Leavitt walks into the lion's den and makes it per Kimmel outmatched. On his own stage, his producer entered quietly holding a phone. "You should see what's happening on Twitter." Jimmy looked up. "Is it bad?" The producer paused, then offered. She made a point. By the time the sun came up, it wasn't just Twitter talking, it was everywhere. Fox News, The Daily Wire, even CNN couldn't ignore it. Clips of Karoline Leavitt's interview were spliced into every news segment. Every headline carried some version of the same message. "Leavitt owns Kimmel on live TV." Kimmel caught flat-footed one sentence that ended the interview, and no matter where you stood politically, you had to admit this wasn't just a viral moment, it was a shift. Cable anchors debated whether Kimmel had invited her as a publicity stunt, or genuinely thought he could control the narrative. One panelist on MSNBC called it the most unintentionally honest moment late night has had in years. Even rival comedians started weighing in. One wrote, "It's not the guest's job to make the host look smart, especially when the guest came smarter." Jimmy Kimmel stayed silent that morning. No tweets, no damage control, no statements, just a few behind the scenes texts to friends that reportedly included the word rough. Karoline, meanwhile, was in full stride. She released a short statement just afternoon. "Truth is undefeated when you let it speak without a filter. Thanks to Jimmy Kimmel for the opportunity." Short, clean, no gloating. She didn't have to. The video was doing all the talking. Podcasts lit up. Commentators on both sides couldn't help but dissect the interview line by line. The sentence, "You do damage control," with a punchline, had already become its own meme. Young conservatives shared it proudly. Independents said it hit a nerve. Even liberals quietly admitted she'd been shockingly well prepared. And that's what stunned the media most. This wasn't a meltdown, it wasn't a tantrum, it was calm, composed, and completely under control. She didn't raise her voice once, she didn't insult him, she didn't storm off or play victim, she just spoke. And for once the media couldn't spin it. There was no gotcha moment to reframe, no quote to take out of context. Every word was already out there, and every viewer had already seen what happened. Karoline had done something rare. She'd flipped the format, not just on Jimmy Kimmel but on the entire late-night playbook, and the ripple effects were just beginning. By Friday night, the pressure inside the late-night bubble had reached a boil. Writer rooms buzzed not with laughter but with anxiety. Executives were calling emergency meetings, and the unspoken question that had lingered since the interview was finally being said out loud: is this format still working? For decades, late-night TV had operated on the same rhythm: mock the right, protect the left, feed the crowd what it already wanted to hear. But Karoline Leavitt had shattered that rhythm with one interview, one sentence, and zero apologies. Producers scoured over the footage trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. They studied the audience reactions, the expressions, the silences, but the truth was too simple to analyze. Jimmy had lost control of the room, and worse, he'd lost control of the story. Karoline hadn't come to play the villain, she hadn't come to be humiliated, she came with facts, with composure, with a sentence so clean it couldn't be buried. "You don't do comedy anymore, Jimmy, you do damage control." It was the kind of line no writer could top, not because it was flashy but because it was true. That truth hit different in an industry built on illusion, and while some networks tried to downplay the moment, calling it a one-off anomaly, others weren't so sure. One former late-night producer went viral with a post that read, "When your audience starts clapping for the guest, and not the host, it's not just a bad night, it's a warning." Karoline, for her part, stayed above the noise. She did no interviews, she refused to gloat, she simply posted a quote to her followers the next morning. "You don't win arguments, you win attention, and then you earn trust." It got over 1 million likes. Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel returned to his desk the next night. He didn't mention Karoline by name, but his monologue felt different. The sarcasm was thinner, the audience quieter. Halfway through he paused, looked into the camera, and for the first time in years he seemed unsure. "Some of you really liked last night's show," he said. "Some of you didn't." "Fair enough," he forced a laugh. "That's the fun of live TV, right?" But it didn't land because everyone watching knew it hadn't been fun, it had been real, and late night didn't know what to do with that. A week later, the buzz still hadn't slowed down. Clips from Karoline's appearance continued making the rounds, now translated into multiple languages. Political channels broke the interview down frame by frame. College debate teams were using it as a case study, and for the first time in recent memory, a late-night host's loss wasn't just embarrassing, it was historic, because Karoline Leavitt hadn't just out-talked Jimmy Kimmel, she changed the rules. For years guests had come on shows like his, prepared to smile, deflect, and survive the comedy gauntlet, but Karoline had done something else entirely. She'd stayed calm, she'd stayed factual, and she'd stayed in control, even as the jokes came, even as the crowd hesitated, even as Jimmy tried every trick in the book to throw her off balance. She had walked in as the underdog and walked out the headline. But perhaps the most shocking moment came days later when a short editorial aired, this time not from a conservative outlet, but from a surprising voice. A longtime political analyst, no fan of the Trump administration, offered this: "Whatever your politics, what we saw wasn't just a PR win, it was clarity. For the first time in a long time, someone sat in that chair and spoke without fear of being mocked into silence that matters." The words rang louder than expected because they came from someone who had once mocked Karoline on air himself. It wasn't just the audience that had shifted, it was the culture. Meanwhile, Karoline kept moving. She didn't ride the wave, she redirected it. No interviews, no victory tour, just one quiet post on her social media. "It was never about me, it was about telling the truth in a room that forgot what it sounded like." That line alone got picked up by major outlets because again she'd said what no one else had, and people noticed. In political circles, her name was now being floated for higher roles. In media circles, late-night hosts were re-evaluating their approach, and in homes across the country people were watching the clip not just once but over and over, not because it was flashy but because it felt honest. And in a world where people are trained to expect a punchline, honesty hits harder than any joke ever could. Karoline Leavitt had walked into the lion's den. She hadn't roared, she hadn't raged, she'd just spoken one sentence, no filter, no script, and she left the stage without raising her voice but raising the standard. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more emotional, dramatic, and unexpected tales. And thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.